And now, since we will no longer be connecting any more particle dynamics to individual objects, we can remove the keyframes that we have on our first object and use the effects linker to link it to our first particle. So I'm going to make sure I have our low poly layer 1 selected, and I'm going to go all the way to the last keyframe and delete the key, and then go to our key at 150 and delete that as well. And we also want to make sure we're deleting for position and scale once again. And go back to 299 and delete that. And now I want to just go to our Animate tab, and I'm going to reset our rotation, and also if we go to Move, reset our position. We can readjust our perspective view to get a better look at the scene. And now we're going to go to our Dynamics tab, select the Effects linker, and for our particles we're going to select Emitter Main, and we're going to replace the object with Low Poly Layer 1. We also need to make sure that we have the right amount of copies and particles. So first I'm just going to cancel this, go to our object, select the Emitter Main, go to its properties, and we want to see how many particles we have. And before, if you remember, we had 15. And since it's baked, we are unable to see exactly what that particle amount is within the name. So we just have to remember that we had 15 particles. And we can go back to the effects linker, select our particles as Emitter Main, and replace the object with Low Poly Layer 1. Set our copy amount to 15. And now we're going to set up some different spin options. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to 15 for our max on all of our axes, and 3 for our minimum for all of our axes. And then if we take a look at the rotation, now I have these settings still carried over from working on the previous section. So I'm going to also keep these settings for our rotation, which is going to move around our objects quite a bit. Although I am going to increase some of these values, 225 on the heading, 180 on our pitch, and our bank I'm going to leave at 85. And our rotation is set to random up at the top, which will be more than enough for the scene. And our scale, I don't really want to change these objects too much in their scale, so I'm just going to bring this down for our max amount to 1.2 on all of our axes. And then we can click OK, and it's going to make our clones, and now we can see them all linked directly to our scene. And we also have each of our particle effects added to each of our objects that are showing up with that nice amount of rotation. And then from there, what we can do is start adding in our new objects, which are going to be our child emitters to our parents. And then we can adjust the hierarchy and change the way that all of these particles are generated. So first I want to just calculate this, and we can take a look at the overall dynamic scene. So I'll open up our object properties, making sure that we have an object selected, and now I can go ahead and calculate that. And if I close out our properties panel, I'm just going to reposition our perspective view, and we can take a look at this a little bit more. And if I hit play, we can also adjust our perspective view and look around the scene as the animation is playing. And that way we can get a better idea of how each one of these particle effects is going to look on each other. And overall that looks pretty good. And what we can start doing is using the next effects link and using some other objects. So at this point I want to save a new version, and we're also going to need to create and modify our objects on the other layers, and we're going to need to make 15 copies first of our individual layer 2, 3, and 4, and that way we have one set up for each individual object, because we will be taking a look at these separately. So go ahead and save that out, and then we can go into Modeler and make some modifications. So within Modeler, I'm going to select each one of our different layers, and I'm going to start with layer 2, and I want to go ahead and just cut this. So Control X on the keyboard, we're going to File, New Object, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. And I'm going to do the same thing, just pasting, Control V, and do this on 15 different layers. Now we have 10 available at first. We can click to the next side and then add 5 more. And now we're going to save this out and load it into the main scene and layout, and then we'll be able to connect these objects to our other particles. And now I have the object loaded in, and if we take a look where layer 2 was before for our object, we now have a null. So what we need to do is remove that null, and we can use the minus key on the keyboard, and it's going to remove that layer from the scene because we no longer need it. And we'll also be removing layer 3 and 4, but first let's take a look, and we can see that we have our low poly number 2, which is what I've called it, and we have 15 different copies. In each individual copy we're going to be using and applying with an effects link to each of these objects emitters. So first I will need to select each one of these copied objects that we have for our larger objects in the scene and larger rocks. And I'm going to need to take our calculations for these and save them out. And the reason for that is it's going to make it much easier on these objects if we have our particles saved out ahead of time, and then when we link them we don't need to worry about changes, and then of course also with the network rendering. So we're going to start with what we have is layer 2. If we take a look at layer 1, it's technically not showing up. So we are going to start with layer 2, which goes all the way to layer 16, which is technically the copy and the last copy, which is actually number 15. So go back to our second one. We're going to open up the object properties. We can see that we have 74 particles, which we need to remember, because since we're going to be saving this animation, we need to know how many copies of those second layers to make. We have 74, and I'm going to go ahead and recalculate this just to make sure everything is working correctly, because we have made some changes. And now we can go to File, and we can save our motion. And now that is loaded in, and now we can move on to our next object, which is number 3. And we have 97 particles this time. I'm going to recalculate. So we will need to create a global amount unless you want to record exactly how many particles each one has, but it looks around 90 should be correct, and we'll translate over to each object, and any leftover ones we can remove from the scene. So now that this new one is calculated, we can go ahead and save this motion out. And I'm going to go ahead and do that for all 15 of these larger objects, and then we can take a look at using the effects linker on each one of them to apply our next scaled down rock object. I now have all of our particles baked and saved out as motion files, so they'll no longer be calculating every single time we drag the time slider, and all of these particles are now fixed. So we can start by using the effects linker once again with each of our objects. And then what we can do is go through our low poly number 2 and start cloning that. And this is going to create a lot of objects in the scene, and from this point on we're going to be creating even more. So we're going to start with low poly layer 1 copy number 2, which is the beginning of our effects linked objects. And for the particles we're going to be selecting our rock low poly layer 2, or layer 1 number 2, which is actually the first one. And we're going to be replacing that object with the low poly number 2 layer 1. And now we need to take a look at our pre-behavior, and basically where this object is going to be before it is generated. And one of the best things we can do is use the size dissolve. Now one of the problems we're going to run into is we might need to change the size of each of these objects, make them a little bit larger, and then scale down our replace object, just because the overall volume and mass is probably not going to match up too much, so we can make some adjustments for that. But I'm going to change our copy to 80, and I can keep our distance set to 1 meter, which is fine, and the size effect, make key, all those are pretty much going to be fine at the default. Most of these turned off because we're not using the size effect within our scene. So all we really need to set up is our rotation of our initial creation of the copies of the objects, and then whether or not we'd like to scale them up or down, and then the random spin, because we are going to have a rotation set to random. So we're going to start out with our rotation just for the creation of the object in the copies to make them look a little bit different. And I'm just going to set these values to 90 for the minimum, and we'll just go ahead and set this to 500 on each of these axes for the maximum, and that'll give us a lot of spin to work with. Our minimum scale I'm going to bring down to 0.5, and our max I am going to keep at 1. And then for our spin, we don't want to have too high of amount, but of course not too low. And we do want these objects to be somewhat rolling off the object and spinning around. I'm going to start the minimum just at 3, and then I'm going to use 5 for the max. And if we need to, we can go back to a previous version before we started the effects linker, and then we can change those values if it needs to be adjusted. I'll go ahead and click OK, and now it's going to create all of those objects, and we can take a look at the scene. And what we're seeing is with that pre-behavior, we have a size effect. If I select one of our objects, and what I want to do is switch to our scale, we're going to take a look, and we can see that it's mostly 0 until it hits its creation, and then we're going to see the size show up. Now there is no nice transition into that size, which means the rocks are just going to kind of pop up, and we can see that showing up if we take a look at the scene. So what we may need to do is just increase the scale of these larger objects in the first objects, just so that it'll engulf that overall area. But with the scaling we have a little bit lower, it does seem that we really won't need to make any scale changes to that specific object, and that should look alright. So we'll switch over to Modeler, and our first layer, the rock low poly, which is our largest object, I'm going to select Shift H on the keyboard, and what I can do is just scale that up a bit, and then if we switch back to layout, those objects will be a little bit bigger. And now if we take a look, instead of seeing the objects could just kind of show up and pop in place, we are going to have them coming out of our object, which is going to look a little bit better. And then we can always add a little bit of hypervoxel effect to that with a little bit of dust on each of those particles, and that'll end up looking even better. And now I want to take a look at our spin and just see how much these objects are kind of rotating around, and it looks like the values we have should be alright, but we may want a little bit more spin on there for our next objects. So what we can do is go through our FX linker, and we're going to select our next object, which is going to be number 3 in the third copy. And now we're going to need to scroll all the way to our available object, and our low poly layer 2, number 2. And then we're also going to make that 80 copies and pretty much keep all of our settings the same. Our spin, however, I will increase the max to 10. Go ahead and click OK. And now we have new objects in the scene showing up at the top. And a pretty good looking effect for that specific object. So I'm going to go through and just do this for each one of our objects, and then just select each object afterwards in the sequence of what they're created, and then we can take a look at the scene from there. And now I've added in and linked all of our objects, and we can take a look and just kind of scrub through the scene. You can see that all of our particles are now being covered up by these rock objects. And we've got a fairly nice looking animation with some good looking debris. And then from here what we can do is start working on our other emitters that will be emitting from each of these smaller objects. And that, of course, we're not going to worry about making each object itself an emitter. We want to use the emitters coming off of our main objects as the parent, and we can go ahead and do that for each of our objects, and then start adding in those smaller debris objects for all 15 of these different larger rocks that we have. So we're going to select particle, HV emitter, and I'm going to call this HV emitter underscore small underscore 01. Click OK. And now before I do anything else, what we can actually do is keep this part of the main group possibly, but first I want to take a look and see which group we have our other objects in. And now scrolling through all of these new objects can be a little tedious, and there are ways we can set this up a little bit differently, and we can take a look at that. Because of course now we have thousands and thousands of these objects within the scene, and as I'm scrolling through we can see all of those showing up, and that can get a little bit overwhelming. Go to our properties and take a look at this emitter, and of course since we have a baked motion, our groups no longer matter, so that's one thing we don't need to worry about anymore. And I'm going to select our object, and instead of scrolling all the way down, if we click on this little box to the right, it's going to open up our chooser for our objects and give us the ability to sort these out and scroll through a little bit quicker. We have a couple of different things we can do. We can create sets of objects, and that way we can sort these a little bit more and kind of get rid of the ones from the view that we don't need showing up. So let's go ahead and just take a look at that really quick. I'm going to expand this window a little bit larger. We can also use the find object search command, and that way if we know exactly what the object is called, we can just kind of type that in and not have to worry about it. But I'm going to select our layer 15 and all of our layer 15 objects. If I hold down shift and then click on the top one, it's going to select all of those objects. If we take a look in the scene, we can see all of those paths showing up for all those smaller objects. And what I want to do is just create a new set, and I'm going to call this MED, pretty much medium, the medium rocks that we have, and then 15. Click OK. So now we have a new set that's been created. And we can set up filters. And then we have our selections. We can also sort these. There's a lot of different things we can do. What I'm going to do is create a filter set and pretty much call it the same thing. We'll do Mead Rock underscore 15. And I just want to select number 14 now, and everything for layer 14, and then create a new set for that. And I'm just going to go through and create sets for all of these objects, and that way we can kind of remove them from the view so they're not showing up, because really you don't need to modify or edit these objects anymore. Therefore we don't need them showing up within this objects menu, so we can hide these filters in each of these sets that we're showing up. So we can go through and create a new set and just start going down the line and create one for each of these objects. And what I also want to do is create a filter for just these main objects and the larger rocks that we have. And if we hold down the control key, we can select those individual objects. If we go all the way down to the bottom, we can select that new emitter. I'm going to create a new filter set for that, and I'm going to call this just main objects. Click OK. And now if we go to our filter, we can select main objects, and now only these objects are going to show up for us to select. If I close this out and we take a look, now we are only going to see those objects showing up, and all of the other ones have been removed. And the reason I was creating smaller sets before of each set of object is because if we select all of them at once, it could take a long time, a little bit of system lag sometimes when you're selecting that many objects with all of the different motion paths. So sometimes it's just easier to create a set of just your main objects, and then we'll have to go through once we create new emitters in order to take a look at that. So let's select the emitter small 01. I'm going to hit M on the keyboard. Our parent item is going to be rock low poly layer 2. And now this is also going to show up with every single object in the scene. So luckily we're at the top right now, and the objects we really want to work on are right there. So that is going to be our parent. Emitter small, go to our properties, and we can select that emitter, generate by second, and we're going to do parent emitter. I'm going to turn down our birth rate to 25. I'm going to increase our particle limit, just about max it out at 1 million. And we just want to take a look, and we can start to see those particles showing up. And we are going to need to add in a little bit of vibration. Go to motion and increase that vibration amount, and let's go ahead and try a value of 2 just to see how that's going to look. And that might be a little bit too much. Bring that down to 0.2, and we can see those spreading out a little bit more. We also want to increase our resistance to 1.5 right now, and our lifetime to 300. And we can take a look at the particles. And now we can see there's an awful lot in the scene right now. And whether or not you want to create that many smaller objects is of course entirely up to you, and really how much your system can handle. But since we're going to be copying this over to other objects, it might be easier to have a lower birth rate, and I'm going to start with 5. And then we can see if we need to increase or decrease that. Because one thing we do have to remember is that all of these are going to become objects, and we also need to make sure that we have enough to complete the scene. Because right now with the lower birth rate, we're not seeing nearly as many created on all of our different rocks, which is one of the problems you can run into. And I can change that to a different type of generation. We could do it by frame and set up some keyframes, but we're still going to run into some issues. So I'm going to increase our birth rate. If you can see all of those objects and all of those different particles showing up. And each one of those particles would be replaced with our low poly rock object. But there's also something else we could do, which will definitely make it much easier. And at this point, instead of using the effects linker, and we already have those smaller objects created, and whether or not we want to use those, we of course can with the effects linker and use this on each of our objects, but we could also use hypervoxels. Hypervoxels can create rock objects that will match our existing ones, and when we're working with a scene like this, it can sometimes be easier just to use hypervoxels. And I'm just going to set up our camera so we can see this area. Maybe zoom in a little bit closer, just so we can see those particles. And now what I'm going to do is hit Control F6 on the keyboard, and we can open up hypervoxels and add that to our scene. Double click on the hypervoxels. And we're going to need to scrub through all the way down to the bottom. Select that emitter small 1. I'm going to open up Viper. You can double click on the emitter small 1 to turn that on. And now we can see all the volumes that are being created. And I want to decrease our particle size. And now we have it set to about 5 millimeters. And then we can add a little bit of size variation to make it more realistic looking. And since we're working with the surface, we can easily change these values. I can set our color to more of that darker brown. Now we can see that showing up, and that might be a little too yellow. Bring that more towards red. And then we can adjust all of the other values. We can set up a bump map for it. Use a procedural texture. I'm going to need to really decrease the size of this though. Let's go ahead and bring it down to 0.1. And now keep in mind our geometry, we have really small objects. We could probably bring this down a little bit more. 0.01, which is going to give us 10 millimeters. Increase our contrast and our small power. Use texture, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this up to 640 by 480, change this to normal mode, and we can take a look at these rocks. If we need to, we can set a little bit of color variation. We can also set up the hypertexture. Change that to turbulence, and that's going to add a little more variation to our rocks. Turn up our amplitude. And then also under shading, I'm going to increase that bump. And we may need to decrease that amount a little bit more. And let's use a 2 millimeter setting for each of our scale options. And now you can see how this many objects in our scene would make it a little too complex, and it would be an extremely slow responsive scene. So what we would want is definitely to use this hypervoxels effect. So we have our effects linker with the hypervoxels, and now we can add in other artifacts as well, or more complexity to our scene. Open hypervoxels back up, and we want to select, of course, which object this is. And since we're working with our first one, rock low poly layer 2, we can turn that on, and now we can see those larger particles. Turn that to a volume. And now what I'm actually going to do is just open up our presets, and we can load in either one of the fires or smoke. I'll go ahead and load in smoke, and we can see that showing up. But what I'm going to do is increase our dissolve to a fairly high amount and change our color to more of a brown. And now we really can't see a whole lot of it because we have that black background. But I do want to change the preview options to scene preview, and we'll be able to see both of these volumes together. So we have a nice bit of dust in there from the larger particles, and then all the smaller particles will create the little rocks that we have. Go ahead and close that out. And now if we need to set up rotation for these particles, since we are not using the effects linker, what we can do is select our object. We're going to go to our emitter small properties, and under rotation we can set random rotation and scale. And if we select this option, we get the same panel as we do with the effects linker. And this gives us the ability to change all of the same settings that we have in the effects linker and allow us to move around our particles. So we can set our rotation to the same settings we had before, or something a little bit larger, just 5 and 10 on random spin. And now we have our particles which will be rotating. And I just want to render out a quick frame so we can take a look at our scene. I'll set this to 800 by 600, and I'll just do 2-pass anti-aliasing, not a real high amount, and we can take a look at one of those rendered frames. And now we can see what one of those objects looks like, and we have each bit of hypervoxel showing up, and we might want to take those smaller rocks and maybe change their color to match the other ones, mess around with our bump map, and make some changes to that overall. But you can see that we have a really complex looking scene so far, and this is just one of our objects, and of course we're going to have 15 of these showing up. And one thing I do want to do is just bring down the size of those hypervoxels a little bit more, and then we're going to go ahead and copy this emitter and make some clones, and then all we need to do is change the parents to other rock objects, and it'll automatically create the effect on our other objects. And we can set up hypervoxels just by copying and pasting. So I'm going to go back into the hypervoxels menu, Control F6, take a look at that emitter small geometry, and I'm going to bring that down to 3 millimeters. Our hypertexture, I'm going to increase the contrast and the small power a little, which will add some more variation to the overall effect. Also, if we take a look at our scale, we can see it's extremely large. And even though I don't really have Viper up, I'll go ahead and open that. We can see all of the smaller objects now, because we want some smaller debris, but we do want variations in their shape, and we can use the scale option here. So I'm going to type in 0.1 and give a 100 millimeter scale option for that turbulence and hypertexture, which is going to distort our object's shape and make it look more like rock. And that's something that looks a little bit better. So I can close that out, and we're going to take a look at another frame. This time I'm going to change our settings. We're going to work with an HD frame, 720p, and that 2-pass anti-aliasing looked alright for what we had before. Go ahead and render out this frame, and then we can start copying everything over to the other objects. And now we can see a nice larger render of that, and our smaller debris objects definitely look a little bit better now, with that decreased size on both the geometry and the hypertexture. And we might want to edit the hypervoxel object that's generating kind of the smoke, and the smaller debris, which would be a very fine debris creating the dust clouds. And basically what I want to do with that is just to have a little bit of velocity stretching, and that way it'll look a little bit better. And then what we can do is just start copying this over to our other objects, and we'll take a look at that really quick in the hypervoxels, and then we can switch over. So we'll select all the way at the top, rock low poly layer 2, and what we want to do for geometry is have stretch direction with velocity, so we'll follow along the path that it's moving on. Select align to path, and our stretch amount we can increase. And now if we want to see a preview of this, there is something that's available within our options for our particle effect. We'll select our objects panel, open that up, and now we're going to have to scroll through all of these different things within the object properties. So I'll go ahead and close that out, and we're going to select this within the layout main options, and then open object properties. We can select the particle emitter for that object, and what we can do is select show size, and right now we're really not seeing that show up. Of course, we do want to select the second one, which is the actual particle effect, and because this is baked, it's going to look a little bit different, and our show size really isn't working too much. We'll go back to hypervoxels, and we're going to select show particles, and now we can see those showing up in our scene very grayed out because of our dissolve amount. If I go back to an earlier frame, maybe we can decrease that dissolve amount, not creating a keyframe, so we can just see that overall shape kind of showing up. Go back and increase that amount. We can close that out, and that should be good. So that's something we want to do within the hypervoxels menu. And I'm going to switch to our perspective view. And now we just want to create this particle effect for all of our objects. And then what we can do is calculate those particles and save them out. And that way it'll work for network rendering. And we're going to go down to our emitter small 1. And we just want to clone that object. We're going to create one clone. Go to the motion options and set the parent to the next object down, which is going to be rock low poly layer 1 number 3. And now we can generate particles from that other object. I do want to delete the key that I ended up creating at frame 161, but now we can see those new particles showing up on the other object, and all we will need to do is just take our hypervoxels and copy and paste that over. So Control F6, open up hypervoxels, scroll all the way down, emitter small 1, and we can copy from the first one, select the second, and just paste. And it might have applied the effects already because we cloned the object, so sometimes we don't need to worry about that. But I'm going to go ahead and apply this to all of our objects now, and then we can take a look at pretty much the completed scene. And now I have all of those emitters added to each of our objects, and hypervoxels has been copied over. But we also need to copy the hypervoxels on the main objects, which is basically those dust clouds. So Control F6 to open up hypervoxels. We're going to scroll up to rock low poly layer 1, number 2, and then we can activate number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and all the way to number 16. And that way we have all of our main objects. Go to our first object, we can copy, and now go through each of our other objects and just select it and hit paste. And that's just going to add in all of those dust cloud objects and hypervoxels to each of the main rocks that we have. Just selecting each one, hitting paste, And then go ahead and close that out. Switch to our camera view. Move to earlier in the animation at frame 0, and I'm going to move our camera into position so we can see this a little bit better. And I'm going to scrub through. And now I'm going to render a frame at around frame 96, and we can take a look at how the scene's going to look. And we can take a look at the completed frame. And actually I had the dissolve changed on our dust cloud objects, and I might want to increase that dissolve amount a little bit higher so that we can see the smaller debris objects a little bit better. So I can go through, maybe increase that dissolve and copy that over to our other objects. But for the most part, this looks really good. Our larger objects might need a little bit of a change on their texture, just because we have some very smooth areas that are all kind of a constant color. May not look correct. But overall it looks really good. It'll end up creating a really interesting looking animation. And if we add in motion blur, and we could always add point lights and connect those, have them as their parents, each one of the larger objects, and have volumetric lighting for maybe some glow effects, add some fire type effects with that as well. We could also use the hypervoxels for that, and even add new emitters to each of the larger objects for that fiery effect if we wanted to have more of a fiery explosion. Maybe add some lights in the center to create a little bit of a glow. It really depends on what you want to do with it. But as far as the dynamics portion of this, it's pretty much done. And you can see by using the hypervoxels for our smaller debris objects, we ended up with a very quick render, something that is much more responsive than all of those polygons would have been. And this actually rendered in under 2 minutes, and even though we only have a 2-pass option for our anti-aliasing, of course we would have much higher passes for motion blur, maybe use the photoreal effect with the advanced camera to get something a little bit better. And if you're working with a quad-core processor, you want to make sure you're using that advanced camera so that you can take advantage of all those different threads while you're rendering the entire frame. But I'm going to just adjust those hypervoxels really quick, create another render, maybe increase the size of the particles, and we can take a look at another render. But for the most part, the scene is done. Okay, and I've made some adjustments where I've just made some of our debris particles in smaller rocks slightly larger. Most of them are still 3 millimeters, but I made some of them 4 millimeters. I also have turned on ray trace shadows. And we can see in some areas that's causing some problems because we are working with such low polygon objects. So what we could always do is take those larger rock objects and maybe increase their polygon count a little bit, but we can easily do that directly within Modeler and just subdivide it maybe one time, add a little bit of jitter, and make sure we triple that out. And then we can get rid of most of those artifacts we're seeing caused by that low polygon mesh. But this is definitely something that looks a little bit better. We could always add a little bit of an animated effect to those dust clouds that we have. But overall it looks pretty good. And we have a very complex explosion animation that's entirely created with particle dynamics.